The crowd was silent, not the quiet of anticipation, but the quiet of disbelief. Thousands of fans stood frozen in the stands, watching a man who had once terrorized NASCAR like a force of nature, sitting in a car that no longer felt like his. No burnouts, no celebrations, no fist pumping through the window. Just a hollow finish line, and a driver who looked like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it. This was Kyle Busch, two-time Cup Series champion, the most polarizing, most decorated, most impossible-to-ignore driver of his generation. A man who spent 15 years making the impossible look routine, and now he was sitting there, quiet, like a man who had lost something he couldn't name. But what happened next shocked even his most loyal supporters, because this wasn't just about a bad race. It wasn't just about a bad season. This was the beginning of something much deeper, a slow unraveling that had been building in the shadows for months. Private tension, closed-door conversations, a relationship with his legendary team quietly, crumbling from the inside out. And when Kyle Busch finally made his move, he didn't just change teams, he changed everything. Turning 40 in NASCAR isn't just a milestone. For a driver built on dominance, aggression, and an ego sharpened by 20 years of winning, it becomes something far more complicated. The question stopped being whether Kyle could still win. The question became, who was Kyle Busch without all of it? To understand where this story ends up, you have to go back to where it all began. Kyle. Thomas Busch grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, and racing wasn't a hobby in that house. It was oxygen. His older brother Kurt was already turning heads in NASCAR, and young Kyle watched every moment from the sidelines. Hungry, restless, and absolutely convinced he could do it better. He wasn't wrong. By the time he was 20, Kyle was already competing at the highest level. And when he joined Joe Gibbs Racing in 2008, the sport felt a shift. This wasn't just a promising young driver filling a seat. This was something different, something louder, something that wasn't going to apologize for taking up space. Though, wins came fast, and they came often. Victories across all three national series. 2 Cup Series championships, 2015 and 2019, that silenced even his harshest critics. A record that may never be matched. They called him Rowdy. And that name wasn't just a nickname. It was a warning. He was brash. He was brilliant. He made enemies just as easily as he made trophies. And Kyle Busch didn't just tolerate that reputation. Some say he built it on purpose, because being hated meant being noticed, and being noticed meant being feared. Then came Samantha, then came Brexton, and somewhere inside all that noise and speed and controversy, a softer story started to emerge. A man who fought privately for things the public never fully understood. A husband, a father, a human being behind the helmet. But even with all that warmth, there was always something burning underneath. And by 2022, the fire was starting to burn the wrong things. 15 years. That's how long Kyle Busch and Joe Gibbs Racing had been building something together. 15 years of wins, championships, heartbreaks, and comeback moments that belonged in highlight reels forever. It should have been one of the great partnerships in motorsport history, but behind the closed doors of that garage, the foundation was quietly cracking. The moment everything shifted had a name, a very familiar, very colorful name. M&M's Kyle's iconic sponsor, the brand so closely tied to his identity that fans couldn't separate the two, announced they were walking away from NASCAR. It was a financial blow, but more than that, it was symbolic. M&M's and Kyle Busch weren't just sponsor and driver. They were a brand identity. And suddenly, that identity had a hole in it. Joe Gibbs Racing needed to find a replacement. Negotiations began. Weeks passed, then months, and Kyle Busch was still waiting. He wanted a contract, a real one, a commitment that said, "After everything you've given this team, we're not done with you yet." What he got instead was silence. No clarity. No deal. Just a quiet that felt colder every week, it continued. And Kyle Busch, a man who built his entire career on certainty, on aggression, on never sitting still, was being left to wait like he was just another driver. He wasn't. And that's when the call came from Richard Childress Racing. RCR offered him what JGR couldn't seem to find. Commitment. A multi-year deal. A clear path forward. A new chapter written on his own terms. But walking away from 15 years, it was never going to be just a business decision, no matter how cleanly it was packaged. When the announcement dropped, NASCAR held its breath. Kyle Busch was leaving Joe Gibbs Racing. The reaction was immediate, and it was everywhere. Fans erupted on social media. Former teammates weighed in. Even rival drivers couldn't stay quiet. Some were stunned. Some were angry. Some quietly admitted they never saw it coming. But here's what got lost in all that noise. At 37 years old, Kyle Busch was betting everything on himself, not on a team, not on a sponsor, on himself, on the belief that Rowdy still had something left that the world hadn't seen yet. He walked into Richard Childress Racing with that same unshakable confidence that made him legendary. But the early days were harder than anyone wanted to admit. The car wasn't at the level he'd had at JGR. The chemistry with the new crew took time. And the results. The results were not what anyone expected from a two-time champion. Critics sharpened their knives quickly. Maybe the move was wrong. Maybe he'd made the biggest mistake of his career. Maybe Kyle Busch had finally outrun his own legend and landed somewhere he couldn't win from. But what nobody was talking about was the weight Kyle was actually carrying. He wasn't just trying to perform on a racetrack. He was rebuilding his entire professional identity from scratch. New team, new dynamics, new expectations, and all of it was happening under the most unforgiving spotlight in motorsport. And then, just when things were starting to find their rhythm, the whispers started, tension inside the team, questions about the car's ceiling, murmurs that this arrangement, no matter how much both sides wanted it to work, might not last as long as anyone had publicly committed to. The situation was getting complicated, and Kyle Busch was heading straight toward 40. 40. In NASCAR, that number lands differently than it does anywhere else. This sport is relentless. It punishes hesitation. It rewards the young and the fearless. Reflexes slow. Recovery takes longer. And every season, a new wave of drivers with nothing to lose comes hunting for the names at the top. Kyle had watched it happen to others. He knew the pattern. What he wasn't prepared for was how personal it would feel when it started happening to him. The 2024 season was difficult in a way that statistics alone couldn't capture. There were still moments, flashes of brilliance that reminded everyone in that garage, and those stands exactly who they were watching. But the consistency that defined his greatest years, it simply wasn't there. And in NASCAR, perception moves fast. The conversation around Kyle Busch changed, not all at once, but steadily, quietly. He stopped being discussed as a dominant force. He started being discussed as a driver in decline. That word carries weight, especially for a man who spent 2 decades making sure it could never be attached to his name. Then came the moment that sent shockwaves through the garage. Reports started surfacing, carefully at first, then louder, that Kyle and RCR were not seeing eye to eye on where things were headed. Questions circulated in paddocks and press rooms. Was Kyle happy? Was the team confident in the direction? How much runway did this partnership actually have? And in a turn that nobody expected from someone like him, Kyle Busch started giving interviews that felt different. The fire was still there, but it was quieter, more guarded, more reflective. This was a man who had never once struggled to tell the world exactly what he thought, suddenly harder to read than he'd ever been in his career. Something had changed inside him, and the sport was watching every interview, every race, every post-race reaction, trying to figure out exactly what it was. Here's the part of Kyle Busch's story that the trophy cases and victory laps never showed. Behind every championship celebration, behind every controversial post-race outburst, behind every moment when the world loved him or despised him, there was a man carrying a standard so impossibly high that even he must have struggled to breathe beneath it sometimes. Win, dominate, never show weakness, never slow down. He built that standard himself before he was 25, and for most of his career, he lived up to it in ways that bordered on supernatural. But at 40, with a sport that had evolved around him and moved on from the era that made him who he was, Kyle Busch was being forced to face something every great champion eventually must: the gap between who you were and who you are right now. The 2024 and 2025 seasons told a complicated story. The brilliance never fully disappeared. There were still moments that made you remember exactly why this man was considered one of the best to ever do it. But alongside those moments came the near misses, the frustrations, the results that didn't reflect what was still burning inside that helmet. And the rumors kept coming. His future at RCR, his timeline, whether the sport's all-time combined series wins leader had already crossed the peak without anyone marking the exact moment. It happened. Kyle pushed back on some of it, dismissed the rest. But for the first time in his entire career, he couldn't outrun the questions by simply winning on Sunday. And somewhere inside that tension, between the legend he'd built and the reality he was living, a different version of Kyle Busch began to surface. One who admitted the grind was real. One who spoke about his family with a vulnerability that felt new. One who sat quietly with the question that every great competitor eventually stops running from: what do I still have left to give? Kyle Busch at 40 is not the final chapter. It's the most complicated one. He is still out there, still competing, still carrying that relentless, almost irrational will to win that made him one of the most decorated drivers this sport has ever produced. The records he built across all 3 national series may never be equaled, but this version of Kyle Busch is not the young man who roared into NASCAR and made everyone deeply, gloriously uncomfortable. He is a father watching Brexton grow up inside the same world that built him. He is a husband who now speaks openly about what this career costs a family. And he is an athlete staring down the final stretch of a journey that was never once ordinary. Whether he wins another championship, whether he races 2 more years or 5, whether his story ends quietly or in one final, unforgettable moment, One thing cannot be argued. He left everything on the track. And NASCAR will be arguing about Kyle Busch, his legacy, his personality, his choices, his greatness, for the next 50 years. That's not the mark of someone who played it safe. That's the mark of someone who was never once afraid to be exactly who he was. So now, we want to hear from you. Do you think Kyle Busch still has one more championship left in him? Or has the sport finally caught up with Rowdy? Drop your honest take in the comments. Because this community always brings the best conversations. And if you're here because you love going deeper than the headlines, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next story we're about to tell, you are not going to want to miss it.